It really is great to be among friends, and I thank you, I thank the CE committee for inviting me to be here tonight, and Keith for that generous and somewhat truthful introduction. We're going to talk about what in the world God is doing in the Middle East, but let me first tell you a little bit about the Outreach Foundation. The Outreach Foundation is a global Presbyterian mission ministry. It is not associated with any particular denomination, Presbyterian denomination, but has representation on the board as well as in the churches and individuals that support it from basically all of the major Presbyterian denominations. And you probably did not know it, but Howard Eddington was one of the founders of the Outreach Foundation back in 1979. So another thank you to Howard. What the Outreach Foundation does is connects churches and individuals here in the United States with partners overseas. It would be better if I... How's that? Is that better?
There you go.
Okay. It connects churches and individuals here that are interested in global mission with partners around the world. And so what I'm going to do is share with you what I have seen through the Outreach Foundation eyes of what God is doing in the Middle East. Now, there's kind of a double meaning here. Many of us, when we see and hear of what's going on in the Middle East, we wonder, is God even there? What in the world is he doing? But I'm here to tell you, he is in the Middle East, and you're going to be surprised and delighted, and praise the Lord for... So, as I say, we're going to be talking about it from really what I would call a Presbyterian perspective. And at the very end, I'll talk about what some of the other Presbyterian entities, denominations, the PCUSA, for example, very active in the Middle East. So is the EPC. So are other denominations around the world. The Evangelical Church in Sweden and in Hungary and other places like that are very active in the Middle East. So first thing, here's a view of the Middle East. There are about 13 countries, not about, there are 13 countries in the Middle East that are outlined by this purple line. It may come as a surprise to you that Afghanistan is not in the Middle East. It's actually in what would be considered Central Asia. But these 13 countries, and I gotta be able to see my notes here. For the most part, the majority do not have any Presbyterian churches in them. There are about 6 or 7 of the 13 countries that do have a national Presbyterian church, surprisingly enough. Let's talk a little bit about the history of the Christian population in the Middle East. Back in the beginning of the 7th century, just as Islam was coming in, the Christian population in the Middle East was about 80%. And then 1,400 years later, it had dropped to 20%. But just in the last 100 years, you can see it's dropped to 5%. So where are those Christians? They are scattered. They are scattered in Lebanon, which has the highest population of Christians, and then Egypt and Syria in the second highest category, and then it drops off pretty precipitously. And you'll notice that there is not much in terms of numbers in some of those southern Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia and Oman and such. That's because there really aren't any. For example, in Qatar, there are about 70,000 Christians, and most of those are nationals that have moved into Qatar, and they are Christians from their home country. But otherwise, there just aren't any. In terms of how the Presbyterians got there, in 1837, the Foreign Mission Board, the Presbyterian Foreign Mission Board, was formed. And what happened with them is they began to send missionaries, American missionaries, out to literally around the world. They sent them, the heavy spots that they sent them to were Korea and China and Africa and the Middle East. And what happened at that point in time is that the church was started by these Presbyterian missionaries within each country. And it was a Presbyterian church, a national Presbyterian church. And then later on, what happened was in the, I would say early 1900s, those Presbyterian missionaries began to give those churches over to the nationals within the country. So, for example, the Presbyterian Church of Egypt, even though it was named that, the Presbytery of the Synod of the Nile, was given over to the nationals in 1917 and became their purvey. Now, that's not to say there weren't missionaries who stayed to help and support it, but the whole idea of mission and the whole new movement in mission is to push it down into the nationals and let them do the work, because that's where the change takes place at the local level. Okay, if you have any questions as I'm talking, feel free to shout them out or raise your hand or whatever. The picture that we're going to look at today is 5 countries. We're going to look at Syria and Lebanon, Lebanon as a part of Syria, as well as we'll take a quick spin through Iraq, Egypt, and Iran. We'll start with Syria and Lebanon. Syria and Lebanon, as you probably know, Lebanon was a part of Syria until right after the First World War, and then became its own state in the 1920s or so, and became an independent state from France in the 1940s. And one of the reasons that there is such a strong population, 40% Christian in that country, is because that's where the missionaries from America started. They landed there. And there was a beaucoup number of them doing that, and they just ended up hanging out there until the work was done, and then they moved out into other areas. The Syrian Lebanese Church, it's called the Synod of Syria and Lebanon. There are 20 Presbyterian churches in Syria. There were 18, but now they've rebuilt 2 of them that had been bombed, and they're operating again. And then there are 20 Presbyterian churches in Lebanon as well. We'll start with Syria. In the Arab Spring, which started in Egypt, as you probably recall, in 2011, being successful as it was in terms of the political movement, in Syria, they borrowed that same concept and began their own Arab Spring. But it didn't take long for that Arab Spring movement to turn into a flat-out civil war. It was a civil war between the rebels and the government, and it was messy. But what's really interesting, and you all probably remember, is that it didn't take long for that two-sided conflict to turn into a very murky conflict, because what you had was radical groups such as Al-Qaeda, which is right here, as well as ISIS, which were the 2 primary groups involved. And what happened then was all hell broke loose. I mean, it really was hell in that country. The civilian population was caught right in the middle of it. This is an apartment building. Let me rephrase that. It was an apartment complex, and I use past tense, in Homs, just north of Damascus. And that war took no difference in terms of who those that were innocent and not involved were. And people just began running for their lives, literally, and leaving. They left their cities, and about half of them, we'll talk about those numbers in just a minute, but about half of them left the country, and half of them left their homes to go elsewhere within Syria. What's interesting is that conflict, that bombing, those mortar shells and rockets had saw no difference between the rebel and government forces and the churches and the mosques. This is the Presbyterian Church in Homs. As you can see, it was hit. It was, quote, caught in the crossfire of a mortar shell that went right through the church. This is let me rephrase that. This was the Presbyterian Church in Aleppo, which, as you may know, saw a ton of fighting, one of the fiercest fighting areas in Syria. And this was the church before it was intentionally bombed, and this is it afterward. So what do you think when you see something like that? And when you talk to these people face to face, well, there's a scripture that comes to mind, one of my favorites, Joshua fighting with God at this point in the book of Joshua. And 4 times God said in those 5 verses, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. And they are. They are persevering. They are staying there. In fact, that little that Aleppo church that you saw bombed, the pastor of that church, Reverend Nasir, went back to the synod and said, "You're going to think I'm crazy, but we got to build the church. We got to build a new church." And they did. In the middle of the Civil War, they built a new church because he said to the synod, "We have to be a presence. We have to be a witness in this conflict." So they did. And the church in Homs cleaned themselves up, and they continued to worship with a hole in their roof because they couldn't get up there without being shot by snipers. And they continued on for years in this same way. And in both cases, the churches were filled with both members of the congregations and other ones who saw that witness and wondered what was going on there. Let's see. Let me just check my notes. One of the biggest problems in Syria was those people that didn't have a home anymore. 6.8 million people left the country to go to other neighboring countries. 6.7, so we're talking more than 13 million people, about half the population left their homes and went elsewhere in Syria. So what happened? Well, this pastor in a church in Maharde, which is right outside of Homs, where there was terrible conflict, had 66 people in his Presbyterian congregation die during this conflict. But he stood up in front of the congregation and he said, "We must stay. We have to be an example to the Christians and the Muslim community about the need for us to spread the word." And they did. Some of those people took in other families into their homes, some of them Muslim families, because again, the bombs didn't know the difference between Muslims and Christians. So they took Christians in as well as Muslims into their homes. That's the work of the church during this difficult time. Back up in Aleppo, the church opened, and in their wisdom, they decided to drill a well for water because the government constantly was shutting off the power as well as the water. They had a generator, and they could generate their own electricity as well as water. But they turned it into a water ministry, and they opened it up. They put some faucets out there, as you can see, as well as providing jugs for water, and both Christians and Muslims came side by side to partake of the clean water that the church provided. And also in that same congregation, the kids were, as you can imagine, just a mess because of what was going on. So they decided, all right, we not only for our own children within the denomination, but also within the neighborhood, we need to bring some semblance of normalcy back to them. And they did. They celebrated Christmas for the first time in about 3 or 4 years. And again, Muslims celebrating Christmas in the Presbyterian Church. Amazing work. Okay. And I guess I should have brought my glasses. But where do things stand today, 3 or 4 years later? Well, the fighting is still going on. The Civil War still is going on. It's not raging as it was before, but it's still dangerous living there in Syria. But the church went on and moved on. In the northwestern part, near Latakia in Syria, the Synod is building this retreat center for not only training leaders, but also to bring congregations over for retreats and relax and restoration. That's the importance of it to them, for their people and the people around them. Also, back up over in Aleppo, this bombed out church in Aleppo, they are rebuilding it today. Literally, as we speak, they are rebuilding it as a Christian center for dialogue, inviting Muslims as well as Christians to come in together to talk, as well as providing other leadership training as well. So they are not beaten. They will not be beaten, as you can see, despite the difficult situation there. Okay, let's move on. What's happening over in Lebanon? You know what's happening in Lebanon now, but just think back in 2015 or so, of those Syrians that were leaving, 1.5 million of them went over the mountain and into Lebanon, into the Bekaa Valley at the bottom of those mountains there. And that swelled the entire national population by a quarter. A quarter of the population ended up being Syrian refugees. So what happened? The church got involved. The Presbyterian Church of Lebanon got involved. They got involved with refugee camps and resettlement. I was there when the Synod handed out Christmas boxes from Samaritan's Purse, one of the most meaningful experiences that I had in my time with the Outreach Foundation. They also found as many buildings that they could convert into apartments for some of the Christian immigrants that were helping in some of the leadership, because the leadership was important, as they knew that the children of Syria needed to continue their schooling, because they knew they'd be going back at some point and not knowing when, but the church was involved in setting up schools. The Lebanese church was involved in setting up schools, and they used some of those Syrian immigrants to help them create a Syrian curriculum, because it was different from the Lebanese curriculum. So the church's great involvement. Okay, now let's move on to Iraq. Anybody have any questions about Syria, Lebanon?
What language did they worship in? Or language?
Arabic. All of these, except for Iran, which we'll talk about, and they don't worship, obviously. They do outside of Iran, but it's all Arabic except for Farsi.
Armenian?
No, they're speaking Arabic. Okay, Iraq. I'm going to move this up so I can see my notes. The Synod of Iraq has 3 operating churches now. One is in Kirkuk, in the northern area. Another is down in Baghdad, and the third is in the southern area of Basra. Now, there were 5 churches there. There was one up in Mosul, and you recall terrible fighting there, as well as Erbil. The Mosul church, actually the oldest Protestant church in the Middle East, built in 1840, was bombed by ISIS during that Mosul invasion. So what happened is that all those people left, and they went down to Kirkuk. About 500,000 people left Mosul, and Kirkuk was the largest town nearby for them to go to. And this is the Presbyterian Church, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church of Kirkuk. They were overrun by people, as you can imagine, with the 500,000 people that ended up in Kirkuk. But what they did is they opened their doors. This is the fellowship hall in the Kirkuk church that they took these families in. Just look at the faces on these people that left Mosul. And this church ministered to them. And interestingly enough, it wasn't just the Christians. You keep hearing me say that. It wasn't just the Christians, but they also ministered to the Muslims. Muslims wouldn't come inside the building, but they'd go outside in the verandas and porches of the church, and they literally lived there until they were resettled. And what did they do? The church provided food and clothing and water to these families, not only in the church itself, but also out within the community. Reverend Hytham in the blue shirt here is the pastor of the Kirkuk church, and he's shown with a Muslim family, providing them with food and water and other supplies. Again, the work of the church. Now we're down in Basra. The church in Basra is in an area that is a little bit more than 98% Muslim. So they are in an area that is very oppressive, lots of persecution in that area of Iraq. This church has about 50 members and is led by an Egyptian pastor, Egyptian Presbyterian pastor that went down there to lead that church. The fact that they are in this oppressive community doesn't bother them. They continue their work. In fact, one of their primary mission activities is a preschool. And again, 98% of those kids in that preschool are Muslim. And what they do is they teach Christian ethics, morals, and standards. They don't teach Jesus because that's against the law. But that effect of what they're teaching really has a significant effect on the kids and their parents. Time for a quick story. When I was in Basra, we got to talking with the pastor of that church, and he told us a story about a little girl who was a student in that preschool who went home one day after school. Her family sat down for dinner, and they started to eat, and the little girl in Arabic says to her Muslim parents, "Wait, we have to say grace before dinner. That's what we do at school." And her parents looked at each other because, that's not in their faith tradition. So they said, "You say it." So, because they didn't know what to say. I don't know what she said, but I do know she said in those words, "God is love." And they went on and finished dinner. The next morning, the family called the director of the preschool. And the director wanted to come in and talk to her. And of course, the director was really upset about what it could possibly be. And the family came in, closed the door behind them, proceeded to tell the director the same story that I just told you, and repeated the "God is love" line. And then they paused and they said, "Tell us more." They became Christians. To be to be a Christian in Iraq, like many other countries, it could be punishable by death, but they were willing to take that chance because of a little child. Okay, I forgot to give you that picture of those cute little Muslim children in the playground. Another one of their key ministries is a radio station. Now, there's a radio station in Baghdad as well as down in Basra, both essentially doing the same thing. But interestingly enough, there are 5 radio stations in Basra. 4 of them are Muslim. The 5th one is the Basra Church's Christian station. And we heard from them that those 4 Muslim stations are always at each other's necks. It is not a pleasant listen on the radio because they're constantly going back at each other. So the Christian station gets a lot of people listening to it. And one of the biggest groups that listen to that station are taxi cab drivers because they're out in their cars all the time. And the pastor told us that many of those taxi cab drivers come to his church surreptitiously and want to talk to him about that radio station or what the radio station is telling him. I don't know what has come of that since I was there, but again, the way that God works through His people in difficult circumstances is pretty darn incredible. So, what do we take from Scripture? We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. And they do persevere, and they do have hope because they're seeing results. Oh, I forgot to tell you, they are rebuilding the Mosul Church. Did I tell you that? They're rebuilding the Mosul Church as well as building a new church in Erbil. So there will soon be 5 Presbyterian churches back in the country. Okay, let's go to Egypt, one of my favorite countries. It is probably the most well-developed country compared to the others that we've discussed, and by far has the most well-developed Presbyterian church system of any country in the Middle East. The Synod of the Nile, which is the highest body, as are the synods in the other countries, the highest bodies. They have more than 400 Presbyterian churches scattered throughout the country. And amazingly enough, more than 100 of those 400 have been started just within the last 10 years. So God is on the move in Egypt. Let's talk a little bit about, can you guys see it? Let's talk a little bit about the problems that are facing Christians in Egypt. There is incredible discrimination and marginalization for the Christians in Egypt, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing is that despite the fact that they are growing, they cannot get church building permits. Mosques go up all the time. Churches, with one exception, which we'll talk about. There are fewer and fewer business opportunities in government and business for Christians. They are being discriminated against. And there is violence against Christians as well, particularly in Upper Egypt, which is the southern part of Egypt. So despite the fact that it is 10%, it feels more oppressive than some of the other countries that I've talked about. Marginalization. In Cairo, there are a number of Christian ghettos. There are areas that are out on the outskirts of town, no services, no public transportation, no sanitation services at all. But they have been pushed out to that area. This is a photo that I took driving down to one of those ghetto churches that we'll talk about. And I couldn't help but see these goats rummaging through trash that was dumped because they have no sanitation service. But what got me even more was within eyesight was this Christian who's doing the same thing as the goats. That's the kind of marginalization these Christians are putting up with in that country. But the church is jumping in, and one of their primary ministries is within developing churches within the Christian ghetto. And this is the neighborhood. In fact, see that little blue awning right there? That's the Christian church, the El Moasa Church. A little closer look, that is an elder, as well as his family, standing in the storefront. And you think, gosh, I couldn't worship here, but they can. Look at that. This is a women's prayer group in that little space that I just showed you. And on Sunday mornings, Fridays, I guess we were there on a Sunday. They have services on Fridays because that's their Sabbath, or the country's Sabbath, but they also worship on Sundays as well. It was rocking. And again, everything was in Arabic, so we didn't understand, but we could sure feel the vibes. And they did pack it out. Another one of the ministries of the Egyptian church is to put churches into what's called the satellite cities. Have any of you heard about some of the satellite cities? What's happened is that the people have been coming in from the country in droves, and they are just packing out Cairo. If you've ever been to Cairo, if you've not been to Cairo, try to avoid it, at least during rush hour, which is all day long. But it is just so packed out. So are a number of the other large cities in Egypt. So as a result, the government has been developing satellite cities outside of these large cities. There are about 17 satellite communities that have been built. And within that satellite community are apartments, stores, retail stores, factories, as well as mosques, and not very often, but occasionally you'll see a church. And in fact, the church in the Synod of the Nile received 13 properties, blank properties, in Egypt, in these satellite cities, to build churches. There was a catch, though, as there always is with the government regarding Christians, and that was that they had to build that church within 18 months, or the government would take that land back again and put a mosque on it. Well, what they do is they work really hard to raise money and build that church. And the first thing to go up is the edifice, and they run out of money, and that's what the inside looks like. But what's really interesting is they just push that scaffolding and those ladders aside, and they sit down, bring in chairs, and that's where they worship, because they know how fortunate they are to be able to worship in a country such as they're in. Questions? Rick?
So you're talking about how many Presbyterian churches there are in these various countries. So what other Christian denominations?
There are a lot, and that's the Presbyterian percentage is about 1% of that 10%. The other 9% is made up of some of the Orthodox denominations, Armenian Orthodox, Catholics. They don't call them Catholics there, but the Catholic denomination. But there are, as I say, just a very small number of the 1% are Presbyterian.
What about the relationship with the Coptic Church?
The Presbyterians get along well with the Coptic Church. When you're in a situation where you're 10% of the total, and you've got the kind of discrimination that is going on with them, you band together, no matter what your beliefs are. And the relationships between those different churches are pretty amazing. And we went and met with the Coptic Church when we were there, and met with the Catholic Church pastors as well. So they know that they need to stick together. Okay, one more ministry that goes on in Egypt is a revitalization ministry. As I said earlier, many of the people are leaving the country and coming into the cities. What you end up with is a very dusty old country town. Eladima. This is Eladima. And if you didn't see those power lines, you might think that you were back in the 600s or 700s in the Middle East. That's really what those little towns look like. And yes, we were stopped by that goat herd as we were trying to get through. So what happens is they leave, those churches break down, but the revitalization efforts of the church then is really strong at this point in time. This is the Eladima Church. It was built in 1907. And once you walk in, you look around and you say, gosh, they haven't done any maintenance in this church since 1907. That's about true. In fact, this church is being rebuilt right now. But it went 30 years without a pastor. Elders were running that church. So you elders, think how lucky you are. 30 years without a pastor, and then they put the synod put a pastor down there, and things began to just take off, and the church blossomed. And they have very devoted members. When I first saw these women, I thought, why are Muslims in here? They aren't Muslims. They are just dressed in the native country dress, and they were. The little lady on the end there, I got to know from the 2 or 3 times that I met her, and she is just a delight and just so on fire for Jesus in that godforsaken place. So as the synod brings these new young pastors, which we'll talk about in just a second, they put them out in these places, and they just go to town, and these churches begin to thrive. Now, how many of you are elders? Here is a brother elder, ladies and gentlemen, in the Presbyterian Church. Okay, one of the greatest gifts that the Egyptian church has done for the country and for the Middle East is to provide pastors. The Evangelical Theological Seminary in Cairo was started in 1863 by American missionaries. And they train pastors and then send them out, just like our theological seminaries. Like our theological seminaries do. They send them to the new church starts in the ghettos. They send them to the new church starts as well as in the satellite cities and also into the country. And they are just a dynamic force. Whether they are, it doesn't matter where they are, but there are still 96 churches of those 400 that are without pastors. But these young dynamic pastors are going out and really making a change in the landscape of that country. This fellow here, his name is Moody, and yes, he was named after Dwight Moody. His dad, Moody's dad, was a very strong Christian down in a Christian enclave on the Nile, and he named him Moody. But Moody is a perfect example of that marginalization and discrimination that I was telling you about. A few years ago, he was in his grandmother's house, and the Muslim Brotherhood came, burnt the house. He and his grandmother and his twin sister escaped. And then he came back up to not only go to school part-time, but to work part-time for a government agency. And his boss, who was Muslim, came to him one day and said, "You don't have a job here anymore because you're a Christian." So he lost his job. But again, how God works, the seminary gave him a full ride scholarship, and he was able to not have to work, get his education quicker, and now he's out in one of those churches that I was talking about. So, what do we take from Scripture on this one? I think Jesus' message in the Beatitudes: "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you, now listen to this. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and say all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. And not only Egyptians, but all the Christians in the Middle East can live to this and identify with this scripture. But they remain faithful. Okay, our last stop is Iran. Iran, you can see where it is geographically, just kind of in the middle there. It's got problems, as you can imagine. After the revolution in the 70s, they were promised all sorts of things, and those promises were never fulfilled. So what you've got is a nation in disarray. It's not as bad as Lebanon, but it's not as bad as Afghanistan, but it's in disarray. 12% unemployment, 10% inflation, widespread political unrest, huge drug addiction problem, huge divorce rate, an incredible increase in suicide because people just don't have hope anymore. They're in a 15-year drought, air pollution, dust storms, all sorts of things that they cannot control. Immigration is increasing. People are leaving the country in droves. Brain drain, many of the brightest are leaving. And there's a low, very low tolerance for apostasy in that country. Converting to Christianity is an offense that can be punishable by death. So, in God's way, He uses this bad for good. The post-revolution generation, my generation, our generation, that lived through that revolution is disgusted with what's going on, and they want change. 70% of the population that's under 30 is looking for something meaningful. It was done in a survey that they were able to get accomplished. The diaspora, which is all those Iranians who have left the country, has a really strong passion for their country, and they're willing to pay the price to get the word back in and to keep things going until that regime is overthrown. And people are really open to the gospel. There is a thirst for the Bible. There are Bibles being smuggled in all the time, a lot of them on jump drives. But the Bible is possible to obtain in Iran. Most of the converts that they are seeing are under 40. And it's that new generation that is open to the Word. And what they're doing, both those in the diaspora as well as those Christians in country, are waiting and preparing for the change that's going to take place in their country. So, how is all this happening? What's the Lord doing there? One of the leaders of the Iranian diaspora is a friend of mine, Sassam Tavasoli. He worked with, or I worked with him at the Outreach Foundation. He was a Muslim, and in his 20s he became a Christian. And since that time, he has devoted his life to getting the word of Jesus Christ out to Iranians, both in country and in diaspora. His ministry really focuses both in terms of leadership training for the Iranians that are in country, as well as doing church for those in the underground churches inside Iran. And they are really working hard to do this in places like Germany. They'll bring those, well, I'll talk about that in just a second. But what's interesting is they're doing it via electronic means, satellite programming is coming into them. And if that doesn't work, they have, like I said, jump drives to sneak below the internet. In fact, you'll laugh at this. Satellite dishes are illegal in Iran. And this is Tehran. Isn't that something? Every once in a while, there's a crackdown, and all the satellite dishes will go away, and then a month later, they're all back up again. And it's just a sign of two things. It's a sign of the corruption in the government, and it's also a sign that those Christians that are putting those satellites up, they're going to find a way to get the word. So how does that happen? Well, it happens through church programming. Sasan is here in Los Angeles taping in Farsi church services that will then be satellite beamed back into the country. And they'll also put a whole number of church services on a jump drive and smuggle those into the country when the satellite dishes are not working. Where do those go? They go to the underground churches. And here is a smuggled photo of an underground church in Iran watching one of Sasan's services. So they're getting that word. They're learning. They're strengthening their understanding and their faith through the work of the diaspora. Okay, now back to where these folks get this training. What happens is they can leave. It's just that these Iranian Christians in diaspora can't go into the country. So the leaders surreptitiously leave the country. They go to places like Germany, Turkey, as well as England to be trained. And this is a training session where they're not only learning theological training, but also leadership training, because it takes a lot to go back and lead a small church that is underground, communications-wise as well as in other respects as well. So then they go back. Now, some of you may be thinking, I've heard a lot about dreams and visions. What role does that play in Iran in particular, but in the Middle East as well? And God is working through dreams and visions. I've heard more stories, one-on-one stories about people who had a dream or a vision and became Christians than you would imagine possible. Uncontrollable, obviously. Well, it's under God's control, but it's not under the church's control. By the way, this is an excellent book that I would commend to you by Tom Doyle. If you're interested, it's a quick read, and it just has a series of stories about some of those conversions that you might enjoy reading. What I'd like to do at this point, in just the remaining couple of minutes, is share with you a couple faces of Iran and some of the brave Iranians that I've met. This is Brother Edward. His brother was killed because he was a Christian. He was slaughtered by the regime, and then they were going after Brother Edward. So he left the country and went to England, which is where I met him. And now he runs a Iranian church in England, in London actually, We were talking about what's happening there, and he said, I argued with God, asking why he was allowing so much to be taken from the church. God responded by asking me how many mosques are filled with Christian converts. Not very many. This is Sarah. She was thrown in jail for 3 months for her leadership in an underground church. She left Iran and now is in England, working not only with the diaspora, but also with the people in country. One of the things that I said to her when I was talking with her was, don't you feel less able to be effective now that you're not in country? And she said, no, my ministry is much more robust now than when I was in Iran. I reach many, many more people, including those in Iran and in the diaspora. Again, because of that, because of electronics. Finally, this is Robert. Robert's on the left, Sasan on the right. He is an Iranian pastor. His story is very similar to Sarah's, where he was put in jail and he left. And he and Sasan worked together in that leadership development and that the church service taping that they do together. In my discussion with Robert, I said to him, when do you think that the regime might be overthrown and that Christianity would be free to blossom? And his statement to me was just so reminiscent of that scripture passage that we just talked about in Matthew. He said, I pray, asking if it's better for God's kingdom if the regime is overthrown now, or if we should have continued persecution, if we should be suffering longer. Isn't that something? Well, that's a view of what God's doing in the Middle East through fellow Presbyterians in their own countries. I took this photograph in the courtyard of the Basra Church the night before we left, and after meeting and hearing the stories from the people not only in Iraq but also elsewhere, I couldn't help but think that when things look darkest, God is still at work. Because again, we know that for him, all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rules or authorities, all things were created through and for him. Thanks a lot. Any questions?